I've spoken to delegates who've come here to Cornwall, have said some really positive things. So thanks to everyone who's spoken and everyone who's come and inputted into the conference so far. Really grateful and really pleased to say that we've got a really exciting agenda for today as well. So hopefully it will just keep getting better. Very briefly to outline what we're doing. This morning, delighted to welcome Dr. Helen Dodd, who is part of Exeter University and is going to be talking to us about child risk and adventure and the benefits of that. We've got Jamie Marshall, who's talking to us about his evaluation work. Finisterre are coming later this morning as well to talk about their foundation, referenced yesterday in Hugo's talk. And then we've got Dr. Eski Britton and the Inclusi team kicking us off after lunch. So really quite august company today. And just to bring things down a bit, I'm going to be talking about our beach school project. No, not really. Actually, we've got Jason Wood and Tark Al-Salwad, who's one of our beach school teachers, and the work they're doing with young people is really fascinating as well. And we've got water and surfing as a tool for wellness with Sasha Cunningham at 3:30. And then Chris and I are just going to be wrapping up, just talking about what we're doing next. Just want to quickly mention that at 5 o'clock at the end of the conference, we're going to do a photo for those of you who are still here. So if we can try and kind of keep to time with that, that'd be great. And that's going to be used by ISTO for future stuff. So hopefully everyone can join us for that. Okay, so yeah, I'm really delighted to welcome Helen to the podium and hand over to you. Thank you very much. They should all be ready.
There we go. And quicker and everything. Amazing. I'm going to put my water down. Hi, it's great to be here. I have a really strange experience right now that for the past 2 days I've been watching this conference virtually from my kitchen, and now I'm here. And you know when you're a kid and you think you can like climb inside the TV? I feel like that's what's just happened. I'm kind of like, wow, I'm in that place that was on the screen. And the view's much nicer from here, I can tell you. What a fantastic spot for a conference. It's great to be here, and thank you to Joe in particular for inviting me to come and speak today. So I am a professor of child psychology at the University of Exeter, and my research is funded by UKRI. I have a thing called a Future Leaders Fellowship from UKRI, which is funding a programme of work over 7 years looking at risk and adventure in relation to children's mental health, particularly anxiety. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the kind of background to that, the sort of theoretical reasons that I think risk and adventure are particularly important for children. And actually, Joe invited me to speak today after we presented at a conference together. And until that conference, I hadn't really made that connection between the work that happens at the Wave Project and surfing and surf therapy and what I talk about when I talk about play in children and adventurous play and risk-taking in play. And then when we were both presenting, we were like, wow, like we're actually talking about the same thing here. And so hopefully that will come across to you guys as well, and it will feel relevant to the work that you're doing. So when we talk about play, what do we mean? So there are entire books written about what play is, what play isn't. There are still regularly heated debates in meetings about whether that's actually play or not play. And so I won't bore you with all of that, but I quite like this definition of play, that play is what children and young people, and I think probably adults as well, do when they're not being told what to do. So somebody has left them alone and they're just getting on with the thing that they want to do, rather than you've got to learn this thing, you've got to sit there, you've got to be this type of person or wear these clothes. They're doing whatever they want to do, and that's play. And play takes place whenever or wherever opportunities arise. So it isn't that only over there, that's the play space. Right? Proper play, free play happens when kids are just allowed the space and autonomy to choose what they want to do and where they want to do it. So free play is exactly that. Children choosing what they want to do, when they want to start, when they want to stop, who they want to do it with. And free play benefits children in lots of ways. So first of all, it's enjoyable. course it's enjoyable because it's the thing that they've chosen to do. So why would they choose to do something that they don't like doing? It increases their sense of control because for once in their life, an adult isn't telling them what to do, isn't telling them it's got to be like this, it's got to be this way, you've got this long. So in that moment, they have control, okay? And, when we think about particularly the past 18 months, how much control has been taken away from children, how important is it to give them, even if it's only half an hour, even if it's an hour, if it's 5 minutes, a little bit of time when they're in control and they're making the decisions. Children use this kind of play to help them make sense of things and to express themselves. So when they're given that autonomy and that freedom to choose how they play, they will use their play to work out stuff that's in their heads, to make sense of things that are going on around them. And we saw, again, examples of this during COVID, that children brought themes of COVID into their play. My own children made up a game called Splat the Virus, where they drew chalk virus blobs on the floor and they jumped up and down on them, a bit like hopscotch. And I watched them create this game together and then jump on this virus. And imagine how good does that feel? Like, this thing is pissing me off, and it's closed my school and I can't see my friends and I'm stuck at home, so I'm going to jump up and down on it and it's going to make me feel a little bit better. So when we allow children a space to play freely, they will use it to feel better about stuff that's going on, right? If we try and set that stuff up, it just doesn't work, right? The children need the space to do it themselves. And it also supports relationships because you're telling them, when you take that step back and you allow them the freedom to play, you're telling them that you trust them, that you think that they have the ability to choose what they want to do, and that's okay. And then, if you're observing the play and they say, will you come and join me? Will you come and, play this role? Or I need somebody to catch the ball with me, or whatever it might be. And you say yes and you join them, that's really powerful for that relationship. Okay? So lots of benefits there to children's free play. We know that this kind of play reduces stress and negative emotion in children, primarily through randomised control trials that have happened with children in hospital. Because outside in the real world, you can't do a randomised control trial where you take play away from some kids to see what happens, right? That would be a really bad thing to do. But when children are in hospital, often they are denied play opportunities because they're in hospital. And so there are trials where people go into hospitals and do really good kind of free play programs with these children. And we see these benefits for their stress and negative emotion. So when hospitalised children are given time for free play, their stress decreases. When children who are in hospital for treatment take part in a free play intervention, then they show lower levels of anxiety and fewer negative emotions. So we know that when children have these opportunities to play freely, they feel better. And I really like this quote. This is from an article from Newsround about why playgrounds were closed during COVID. And children are allowed to comment on Newsround articles. And I don't know if you've ever spent any time looking at this, but if you try and comment as an adult, it won't allow you to. It's somehow, your computer knows that you're grown up and won't let you. But children can comment, and it's a really nice way, actually, of getting a perspective of what children are thinking. And this comment really stood out to me. This child said, "I think it's rather sad that playgrounds have shut because it can give me chance to breathe." And that's what play is to children, right? It's like breathing, it's space, it's breath, it's air. And just being stuck at home with all the stuff that might be happening at home, or being at school with all the stuff that's happening at school, they don't have that space to breathe. Play gives them that space. Okay, so in January this year, I published this paper, which is freely available if anybody wants to download it and read it. It's a bit hefty, but pretty much everything that I'll say today is in there, plus a whole lot of other stuff. But it's a kind of theoretical idea that adventurous play might reduce risk for childhood anxiety. And this link between adventurous play and childhood anxiety came about because until about 2 or 3 years ago, I hadn't really ever thought about play. I was a child psychologist, I was thinking about mental health, and all the research I'd done was about why children become anxious, risk factors for anxiety, how do we prevent children from becoming anxious. And then I became a mum, and I watched my children play, and I realised that what they do when they play gives them all these opportunities that I think exactly map on to the things that we know are risk factors for child anxiety. So I started talking about it with a few people. Some people told me it made some kind of sense. And then I worked with this brilliant colleague, Catherine Lester, and we eventually managed to turn this into a kind of idea. And so that's what I'm going to be talking you through shortly. But firstly, why think about anxiety? You know, of all the kind of mental health things that's going on with kids, of all the developmental things that happen for children that are important, why anxiety? Why focus on that? So between 2004 and 2017, we saw a 49% increase in emotional disorders in children in England. And of those emotional disorders, anxiety disorders are the most common. Okay, so if you take a child with a mental health problem, the most likely mental health problem they will have would be anxiety disorder. And anxiety is what we call a gateway disorder. So it's often the first mental health problem that a child will have. Most anxiety disorders start before the age of 18. So if you meet an adult with an anxiety disorder, chances are they were already anxious before they became an adult. And if it's left untreated and unsupported, anxiety in childhood is linked to long-term mental health problems and other difficulties like substance abuse. So it's often the first mental health problem, and if we don't support children when they become anxious, then we set them off on a trajectory of mental health problems in the long term. And we know that those pathways for anxiety begin early in life. I've done work with children from the age of 3, and we've followed them. These kids now are about 19, and you can see, when they were 3, there were things there that we could already see that predicted what their anxiety was going to be like across all of that time. Okay, those pathways are there early, and so we can help early, and then we can get them onto a good trajectory, right? And I always think about that it's sort of nudging kids onto the right trajectories. Okay, so there are various factors that sort of previous work that I'd done and work that other people had done about factors related to anxiety that I felt could be picked up by adventurous play or opportunity for adventure more broadly. I'm going to go through these in more detail, but they are maladaptive coping or feeling like you can't cope with things. And what we call intolerance of uncertainty, which is not being able to cope with uncertainty, not liking uncertainty and avoiding it. Anxiety sensitivity or misinterpretation of arousal. So that's, when your heart's racing or you've got butterflies in your stomach or something, that you interpret that as something terrible is happening. And avoidance. So I'm not going to do that thing because it's scary. Okay. So each of those things I'm just going to go through now to explain in a bit more detail. And then I'll talk to you about the adventure part and how I think adventure provides opportunity for addressing each of those things. So when we think about coping, we know from research that anxious children use what we call more maladaptive and less adaptive coping skills in response to negative life events. So when bad things happen, if you're already anxious, the way that you respond to that to cope isn't a way that's healthy, it tends to be a way that's unhealthy. We know that anxious children think that they won't be able to cope or will be less likely to cope in a future hypothetical situation. So if you say to an anxious child, imagine that a friend from school is having a party and you don't get invited, how well will you cope with that situation? They will tell you that it will be horrendous and they can't possibly cope with that, okay? Compared to a non-anxious child who might be like, well, that'd be a bit rubbish, but that'd be okay. Okay, so they think that they won't be able to cope. And when we do treatment for anxiety, so Phil Kendall is kind of a pioneer of child anxiety treatment. What it is we're trying to do, in his words, is create a coping template. So we want children to have this mindset that they can cope and a sort of template or toolkit that they're carrying with them about how to cope. They know how to cope. They know they have the ability to cope, and they therefore feel like they can. And when we look at treatment, if we improve coping, that mediates treatment outcomes. So the kids whose coping gets better, their anxiety gets better too. Okay, so coping and believing that you can cope with what life throws at you is a really key ingredient in making sure that children don't become overly anxious. Okay, so hands up in the room who really likes uncertainty. Who likes being in situations where you're like, I don't know what's going to happen? There must, I'm not in this room, there must be people that like uncertainty. Okay. Hands up if you really don't like it and you really like to know exactly, when am I going to go? Where am I going? What time am I going to get there? Okay, right. And then there's probably the rest of you somewhere in the middle or your hands don't work. So We differ, right? Naturally, we differ from one another in how okay with uncertainty we are. Some people love it, right? They book the mystery hotel online and they just rock up at the airport. They don't know where they're going, and isn't that fantastic? And I might be going somewhere hot, I might be going somewhere cold. Brilliant, let's do it. It's so exciting. And other people, that's their worst nightmare, and they're just like, I need to know, and I need to make sure I'm there, and I get there a day early so I don't miss my flight. And then most people are in the middle somewhere. But the people who really don't like uncertainty, who can't manage with uncertainty, might have what we call intolerance of uncertainty. So where the uncertainty causes a lot of discomfort. I can't sit with this uncertainty. I need to know the answers to everything. And this is related quite strongly to anxiety and worry. And some work we did recently showed in children and adolescents that's the case as well. So helping people to become more okay with uncertainty and sit with uncertainty and be all right with that reduces symptoms of anxiety. And therefore, if we can help kids be exposed to uncertainty and be all right with uncertainty, then it should reduce their risk of anxiety over time. So physiological arousal is something that happens to all of us. Anybody who's stood up here and given a talk the past couple of days will have felt it a little bit, right? Your heart races a bit, got a bit of adrenaline going on. It's a very normal reaction to any sort of situation where your stress is slightly raised or you feel like there's some kind of threat. Sometimes it's excitement, sometimes it's thrill, sometimes it's terror, depends on the situation. But your heart beats fast, your palms are sweating, your stomach feels a bit off. And when people are anxious, often they interpret those signals in the wrong way. So I can feel that those things happen, and I know it's because I'm standing here and I'm giving a presentation, and actually it'll help me to focus and make sure I make some kind of sense. But if I was really anxious, I might think something might be wrong with my heart. What if something's wrong? And then I might have a heart attack in front of you all, and that would be bad, wouldn't it? So this anxiety sensitivity is kind of a fear of feeling anxious, a fear of those feelings in your body. And that's associated with a range of anxiety disorders and predicts anxiety over time. So if you have children who really don't like those kind of feelings in their body, then they're more likely to have difficulties with anxiety over time. And we know, again, if we can change this, then that leads to improvements in anxiety. Okay, and then who wants to run away when somebody says something like, why don't you come up here and do a dance? Right? That's, again, what we naturally do when, a tiger jumps out of you in the jungle. You want to get away from it, right? You want to avoid it. It's part of our fear response. But often we start avoiding things that aren't objectively scary. We avoid them because they're scary for us. And there are children who are avoidant of things that are new, things that are uncertain, things that are a little bit scary. And they will, they retreat to their parents when they're very little. When they're older, they'll just refuse to go. Or they'll smash up some stuff, or, say that they're not going to go, or they'll behave in a way that means that they get kicked out and they don't get to go. All of that is trying to avoid something which is scary, right? When parents support that avoidance, children are more at risk for anxiety. So being avoidant in itself is a risk for anxiety. When parents say, do you know what, it's all right, don't do that thing that's scary. You stay here with me. You don't have to go to school today. I know school's really scary. Then they become more likely to be anxious. And in almost all early intervention or prevention programs for anxiety, avoidance is the key thing that's targeted. So what children need to do, same as adults, if you're scared of something, is you have to be exposed to it, right? You fall off your bike, you get back on the bike, right? You can't avoid things you're scared of if you want to no longer be scared of them. And the same is true with kids. So imagine a child who is a little bit anxious when they're young. They think they're not going to cope well with things. They avoid situations that are a bit scary. Their parent says that that's fine. They're increasing that risk for anxiety, right? And so we need to do what we can to create an environment that allows children to have those experiences so that we're then reducing some of that risk. So when people avoid things, they lose those opportunities. And what we need to do is to give them those opportunities. So to learn to cope and build a coping template, children need to be exposed to situations where they're required to cope. None of us will learn to cope if we're never in a situation where we have to cope, okay? None of us will learn to speak French if we never hear French, right? It's simple. To decrease intolerance to uncertainty, children need to be exposed to uncertainty, okay? They have to actually feel it. It can't be theoretical. You can't sit down and explain to them that uncertainty isn't scary. They need to be in uncertainty and be okay with it. And changing anxiety sensitivity, so the way that they're interpreting things that are happening in their body, is likely to require exposure to those things that are happening in their bodies. Okay, so saying to a child, oh, when your heart beats really fast, it doesn't mean you're having a heart attack, it's fine, is not the same as them feeling it and realising that they're fine. So for me, adventurous play is exciting, thrilling play where the child experiences a level of fear and is able to take age-appropriate risks. We're at a surf therapy conference. Can anybody think of another situation where a child might feel excitement, thrill, experience a level of fear and be able to take age-appropriate risks? So these are some pictures of what I think adventurous play might look like. And when I show these pictures, I really like getting people to look at the faces of the kids. You know, they're not hating that, are they, right? They're smiling because it's challenging, but then it's fun. And they're on that edge of like, this is a bit risky, but it's also really fun. This is a picture of a school playground, believe it or not. A child jumping off, and more kids having fun doing adventurous things at school. So I think adventurous play provides a positive context where children are motivated to engage rather than avoid situations where they might experience some fear. Providing natural exposures and an opportunity to learn about physiological arousal, about coping, about uncertainty. I don't know if this is going to work. This is a video. No, that's okay. Maybe there's some way we could share that on the chat or something later. So what do children think? Like, am I just standing here saying, isn't this all wonderful? And kids are like, but we hate that. We don't want to do that thing. We're not want to play in that way. So these are some quotes from some research for children. I did it once and I did okay, and I felt happy and scared at the same time. I couldn't stop myself. You feel excited because you're out of your comfort zone, but you're enjoying yourself. I feel free and confident and on top of the world because I'm really high. And do you feel like those are the kind of things, like could these be quotes from people who've taken part in the WAVE project, for example? Yeah, very similar, yeah. So the popular press like to talk a lot about how we're overprotecting our children and how that's fueling mental illness. This is a headline from The Guardian a couple of years ago. But it comes up, you know, kind of a couple of times a year in the media, at least. And there's been various other kind of theoretical psychologists, play experts, who've also written about this connection between declining opportunities for play, particularly free play, and children's mental health. But what I'm trying to do is to kind of, lots of it is just in theory, like it makes sense and everybody nods along when you talk about it, but to actually get people to take it seriously and to invest in opportunities for children to have adventures and adventurous play, we might need some better numbers, right, to show that link between these things. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I've got this 7-year funding. I'm 2 years into that, so I haven't done a lot so far. So what I'm trying to do is to evaluate whether increasing children's adventurous play has a positive effect on their anxiety symptoms or their risk, as we would expect it to. But what we're trying to do is really collect the data to kind of evidence that. So similar to what Hannah was saying yesterday morning about evaluating the WAVE project. So you have to have the kind of evidence to show that something works to get anybody to listen often. So I'm working with a range of fantastic partners on that work. And hopefully I can come and talk at one of these conferences in a couple of years and show you some numbers, and we can all be really excited and happy that that's going to happen. Okay, so been talking about adventurous play. Some of you might be thinking, what on earth has this got to do with surf therapy? So children's mental health, I think adventure's good for it. Hopefully I'll have some data to demonstrate that at some point in the future. But what we do know fairly categorically is that being outdoors is good for kids' mental health. The more time children spend outdoors, the better their mental health is. We also know that being in nature has a range of benefits for our mental health as adults, for children's mental health. So use of green space and even having views of green space are both associated with increased self-esteem, life satisfaction and happiness. And during the COVID lockdown, related to lower depression, anxiety and loneliness. The same is probably true of blue space, being able to see the sea. Natural environments reduce physiological markers of stress. So this should be the most chilled out conference ever. Although it would be better if we were outside, to be fair, but I'll take what I can. And spending time in nature leads to improvements in mental health and emotion regulation for children. Okay, being outdoors is good for mental health. Being in nature is good for mental health. These things are proven, right? There is ample evidence to support that. So I wanted to talk briefly about this study that was conducted in 2020 in Sheffield with some young people who live in Sheffield, about how urban nature supports their mental health. So this is about the importance of nature, but particularly in an urban environment where they don't have views like we have today. And these young people talked about their encounters with nature being accepting and relational. So I feel, connected to the trees, etc., to the land, and I have a relationship with them. That being in nature offers a stronger sense of self. They have a better sense of who they are when they're in nature. It provides feelings of escape. Like I can escape all the noise and all the busyness because I'm in nature. And that connection and care with the human and non-human world. And so one of the reasons I wanted to show this was that I think I can imagine that lots of those themes come out when you talk about children spending time in the water or even by the water. That sense of that it's accepting of you, that it's an escape from everything else. And there's some quotes here from that study that I quite like. And one of them is, I guess it's just like the idea of being around nature I find very soothing. I think it's ego-free. You don't have to have like a mask on or anything. And this is before COVID, so the mask thing isn't about a COVID mask, but that you don't need to be pretending. You don't need to be, putting on this facade when you're in nature. You can just be yourself. And as a mood management tool, nature's really important, and being able to go out, and especially with friends, just to be out and away from the city and away from, metaphorically away from the problems that are within the city and literally away from them. And I think this is really nice for just thinking about what nature offers young people, okay? And if we know that, we know how we feel when we're in nature. But these are kids that live in a city, that aren't necessarily in contact with nature all the time. And when they leave and when they have that contact, this is how powerful that is and how it makes them feel. There's also a wide range of research on adventure therapy and wilderness therapy, where children and young people are taken kind of out of their city or away from where they live into remote parts of the country and into nature. And there's a really wide range of research showing positive effects of that kind of work. So wilderness therapy, for example, reduces distress related to social and mental health difficulties. Outdoor programs lead to reductions in substance abuse. Adventure therapy increases motivation to change. And wilderness therapy supports interpersonal relations in young offenders. So there's various different pieces of research with different groups of young people who've come to that adventure therapy for different reasons, but really convincing kind of wide-ranging benefits there. And of course, you heard yesterday from Hannah about the evaluations of the WAVE project, similarly showing these benefits for children's mental health. So is there a problem in terms of what life looks like for young people growing up today? Okay, so should we only be thinking about adventure and nature and making sure that kids have that for the children who've got a referral from their GP because they've got a mental health problem? Okay. I was presenting at a different conference yesterday, and somebody had a picture of a waterfall. So picture Niagara Falls, if you will, for a minute. And they were talking about how, right at the bottom of the waterfall, it's messy and noisy and everything's crashing, okay? And those are the kids that are getting referred because everything is really bad for them, right? They're really struggling and this water's coming down on top of them. And imagine being in that and how that would feel, right? And those kids need help. yeah? They need access, ideally, to evidence-based treatment, and they need it quickly. But then there's also the kids who are at the top, and it's nice and calm for the most part, but there's some rocks along the way, and if they misstep a bit, they're going to end up going over that waterfall, okay? So do we need to care about the kids at the top, or are we just thinking about the kids at the bottom? So what I want to do now is just talk about what life looks like for the kids who might not necessarily be at the bottom yet and getting referred and everything's awful for them, but the other kids, okay? So in the space of a generation, the amount of time that children spend playing outdoors has decreased from 40% to about 10% estimated. These are figures from 2009. I could imagine that they may actually be worse now. This is a really staggering statistic from 2015. 1.3 million children in the UK spent no time in natural space in 2015. So they didn't go to the beach, they didn't go to a woods, they didn't play on a kind of meadow, heathland, they didn't play on farmland, no time in wild natural spaces at all. 1.3 million of them. It just blows my mind every time I present that. And then there's ridiculous things like it's estimated that 5% of schools have banned children from playing tag on the playground because they might fall over or they might rip each other's clothes. And so what are we doing? Like, do we want childhood to look like this for those kids that are at the top, right? These aren't the ones that are falling. This is just normal life. And of course, we've had COVID. So I presented earlier the data on what had happened for mental health between 2004 and 2017, increase of 49%. Between 2017 and 2020, another 50% increase. So it's estimated now that 1 in 6 kids have got a probable mental health problem, which means that they're above a cutoff on a questionnaire measure. That's not okay, is it? Like, I just don't feel all right about that. This is from some research that I've been involved in, which has tracked children's attention, emotional behaviour problems over COVID. And what you can see here is during the first lockdown, so up is bad, down is good, okay? So during the first lockdown, everything goes up, gets worse. Then last summer, everything comes down again because it's summer and is COVID over? And then, oh no, it's not over, and lockdown comes and they go back up again. So if you want to know if COVID's been bad for kids' mental health and if lockdown is bad for children's mental health, this fairly conclusively tells you that it is. What we're seeing now is that lots of children are recovering quite quickly, which is great, but the children who are not recovering quickly are the children from low-income families, children with special educational needs, and children whose parents are in distress. You know, that's not surprising, but it's really worrying because those kids have gone up and they're not going to come back down unless we do something to help them. So there's lots of children on this kind of flat bit at the top. Hopefully most of them will stay there, but they need time outdoors, access to nature. They need adventure in their lives to keep them up there, okay? And that's what I'm really interested in, is how do we make sure that all children are getting enough time outdoors, enough opportunity to take those risks, to feel that sense of freedom, and we prevent mental health problems. We prevent them from getting to the point where they're at the bottom of the waterfall and they're crashing. Of course, we also want to help the kids that are there. That's, you know, that's unnegotiable. But it's not just about those kids. It's not always just about treatment. Because if we get the other stuff right, fewer kids will go over the edge. Fewer kids will need treatment. Wouldn't that be great, right? But that requires a long-term plan, long-term investment in children's well-being, rather than just reacting to, there's this many kids who need treatment right now. We need to think about what life looks like for children. So what now? We need to continue to support children's recovery from the pandemic. They need outdoor play, they need physical exercise, they need time with their friends, and they need opportunity for adventure and freedom. And just in case it hasn't been clear all the way through, this is not about 5-year-olds, okay? This is about all children, adolescents, young people, and arguably us, right? Who doesn't want to be outdoors playing, physically active with their friends and having adventure and freedom, right? So yeah, fantastic work that all of you are doing in supporting children to do that. And anything that I can do to help you do more of that, then let me know. So I think that brings us to the end. Thank you. that okay? Was that quite quick?
That's brilliant. Well, actually, it's great because it gives us some time for questions, which has been, I think people have them while you're here and I'd like to have the opportunity to ask you some questions. We've got, I don't know whether you saw this, but we've got an app that enables us to for our live stream audience to ask questions, and I'll just take some questions from the room as well. I'm just going to, if you give me a moment, sorry. I noticed there is a couple of questions from the app. Maybe if I just open it up to the floor first, if anyone here has some questions for Helen. I'll just pass the mic. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for your research. It's so important. I'm interested in the role of the adult in the Adventurous play in terms of co-regulation and offering safety, or not offering that.
Yeah.
And how you have looked into that within the research.
Yeah. So I think, the role of the adult is to make sure that no one dies, right? Like, seriously. You're keeping them safe, but not too safe, yeah? So your role, if you're kind of setting up a situation for Adventurous play, then you should be thinking, how can I give these children as much space and freedom to explore as possible, whilst making sure that that they are safe, that they're safe enough, and it's to provide a secure place for them to come back to, so they know you're there, right? If something goes horrendously wrong, they know that somebody's there. They know that it's contained somehow, right? Kids don't like total. There are no boundaries. There are no rules. They don't really know what to do with that. They like freedom, but they want to know these are the edges of that. So what are the rules? Could you come up with one or two simple rules that would be enough, that would allow them that freedom to play? And it massively depends on the age of the children and the competencies of the children. And I think to some extent it needs to be with, if it's children that then you're in a better position to judge what's too much for them, etc. But actually there's pretty decent evidence that if you give kids a space, they actually manage their risk themselves very well. Children have a desire to protect themselves in the same way as we do. They don't actually want to get hurt. And if they're more likely to hurt themselves if you're like, no, don't do that, you're not allowed to do that. And they get really bored and then they go jump off something, right? So it's about giving them the space, trusting them that they can judge the risk, but being clear where the boundaries are, and then being present if they do need you. Does that make sense?
It's not working.
There we go.
So the adult is like the secure base and offering containment and boundaries.
Yeah.
But allowing them to explore and be free within that.
Within those boundaries, yeah.
So it's important for an adult or adults to be there, but also to give them that freedom.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the age of the child and like the situation that we're talking about. So, in terms of kind of giving kids independence, like letting them walk to school by themselves, for example, if they're ready to do that and they're old enough to do that, then great. Children don't want to be watched and accompanied by adults everywhere they go. But if they're 5, then you probably don't want to do that. So I guess it's thinking about what is an appropriate level of risk for this child, and maybe asking yourself, am I giving this child as much freedom and space as I could? Or am I jumping in or bringing those boundaries in too close because of things that I'm worried about, because of my anxiety? Does that make sense? It's kind of, I guess, being mindful and reflecting on how are you influencing the children around you? Could you be giving them more freedom? Do they want more freedom? So you don't want to be putting them into situations that are really scary for them. That's not the point. The point is that they have the freedom to find their way and to work out what's comfortable for them.
Yes,
yeah?
I'm thinking about it in terms of children that maybe haven't established any healthy attachments yet.
Yeah.
And how that can be managed within.
It definitely is more difficult with children who've experienced trauma or who don't have a healthy attachment to feel like they've got that secure base where they can rely on somebody. And then maybe partly it's about building that relationship with them a little bit first before you really open up the risk side of things. But again, it depends on where you are, like how contained it can be. So the video that I was going to show was an adventure playground, and there, there's only so much space and there's only so many things in there, and so it's relatively easy to allow them the freedom because they're going to be in that space. But if you're taking a child out into the ocean, that doesn't have fences, right? It's not boundaried, so the risk level in a way is high, and you need to be a bit more mindful, I think, about what it is you're doing. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
There's quite a few questions on the app, but
Okay.
this is what's got their hand up. So I'm just going to take another one from the floor, and
Yeah,
I'll
no worries.
move over to the app questions.
Thanks for that. So I've done some surf instructing with young kids and with school groups. And just to pick up on your point about sort of prevention as well as treatment,
Yeah.
is there a sense that if we're getting kids out surfing just for lessons, that's great as it is? Or actually, have you got a couple of top tips that we could actually start giving to surf instructors who are working with school kids where we don't know that there's mental health stuff going on, and
Yeah.
we're mindful about it to really help them get the most out of that?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two aspects to that. So one of them is that there will be the children who maybe the kind of regular surf lessons aren't actually that exciting for them. And you might be wanting to look out for them and thinking, how can you challenge them a little bit more? Can you take them to slightly bigger waves, or can you, there was a thing I saw yesterday at a school where some children were climbing up a wall, and one of the kids was really good at it and it was too easy, so they made her do it with one hand behind her back. And it's just an example of how can you make it a little bit more challenging so that those children are getting that real this is really adventurous, and it isn't boring for those kids at that end of the scale. But then if you took a class of kids out surfing, you're going to have a handful at least, I would imagine, who are going to be quite scared and anxious. And so you can kind of anticipate that that's going to happen. The level of anxiety will differ, but some of them, and I imagine that's been your experience, some of them won't want to get in the water or be a bit unsure. And so for those kids, it's about being sensitive to that. So what I'm talking about when I talk about adventure is that kind of the space at the edge of your comfort zone, right, where you feel uncertain, where it's not entirely comfortable, but it's still enjoyable. And if you go too far past that, then you just have fear, right? And that's not productive for any of us. And so you're thinking about, for that child, where is the edge? Where's the boundary for them? And you trying to encourage kids into that. So whereas you might think, do you know what, just walking in the water isn't scary, just get on with it. Actually, for them, that might be the adventure for that day. So I guess it's about thinking about and appreciating that for every child, the adventure bit, the edge of the comfort zone bit, is in a different place. And what you're trying to do, because they're already outdoors and they're already in nature, fantastic, they'll get all the benefits from that. And then what you're trying to do is ensure that you're sensitively getting the kids into that zone. And for some of them, that's going to be challenging them more to get them up there. And for others, actually, you might be asking too much and they're just going straight to fear. And where you want them to be is that edge. And if they're doing it regularly, if they go to the edge this week, the edge will be somewhere different next week. And then eventually you can kind of get them in and get them doing more, which I'm sure is what you do anyway, probably, and you're just intuitively what you do. But I guess it's, just being mindful of where's that sweet spot for that child, and recognising that that's going to be different across kids. Does that help?
Thanks.
Yeah.
And do you mind if I just jump in super quick to say, because you got me thinking about challenge skill ratio and flow research. So
Yeah.
It all sounds like
It all really links into flow, yeah.
Has that link been drawn explicitly?
I don't know explicitly. It's definitely linked in my head. But I don't know that it has been hugely. I mean, maybe there's a book called Adventure Revolution by Belinda Kerr. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I recommend it. If not, she's fantastic. And I think she talks about it a bit in there that, when you're climbing or surfing and things, when you're in that adventure place, that you do end up in this kind of flow state, and it's almost meditative, right? And that's perhaps one of the benefits of those activities for mental health, is that idea that the children talked about there, about feeling the sense of escape, that when you're in a flow state, the only thing that matters is that thing you're doing, isn't it? And you do escape everything else. So I think they're definitely aligned. But it tends to be in sciencey stuff that the flow people talk about flow, right? And the play people talk about play, and the adventure people talk about adventure, and don't necessarily speak to one another, which is great if we're coming to things like this and realising those kind of links between different pieces of work that people are doing. So.
Thanks, Helen. Which is interesting, you mentioned Belinda Kirk, because she talks about surf therapy in the book.
She does, she talks about the Wave Project specifically.
Project,
yeah.
Just thought we'd get that in there. So I'm going to move over to a couple of questions that have come through the digital. Yeah. This is one that's had the most votes so far. At surf therapy sessions, I often find that highly anxious children have highly anxious parents. Do you have any tips for supporting the parents in these situations alongside the children?
Yeah. I remember us talking about that a while ago, Joe, that absolutely, anxiety runs in families. If you take an anxious child, they're more likely to have an anxious parent. The research shows that's more likely to be the mum than the dad. So I think, again, there's a couple of things going on there. In terms of the parent, you want them to understand why you're doing what you're doing and what the benefits are for the children. Okay, so sometimes that is just explaining, this is the reason we're doing this is what we're hoping to achieve, maybe a bit about the numbers, like we've done research on this, we know that this helps kids, we know it can be challenging, but that's kind of the point, it's supposed to be a little bit difficult for them, so that they understand, okay, my child is in safe hands, they know what they're doing this intentionally, they might feel a bit uncomfortable, and there's a point to that and there's a purpose. And then there's getting them to recognise that their own anxiety might be getting in the way a little bit. And the extent to which it's their anxiety and not their child's anxiety, which should, I think, just be a conversation, but it needs to be a very sensitive conversation. So if you can get the parent and the child separated so that the child is off and they're doing their thing, and, then having a conversation with the parent about, how are you feeling about this? Does it feel like a big deal that they're going to do that? And recognising that can be hard, right? It can be, if you're anxious and you know that your child is anxious and is going to find this thing difficult, then sitting there and watching them, sending them off with these people that you don't know to go into the horrible, scary ocean, of course that feels anxiety provoking. So it's just acknowledging that and talking to them about that. And is there anything that we can do? Is there anything that would reassure you, that would help you? And just being understanding, your job isn't to be the therapist for that parent. You can't take on that role. But I think what you can do is understand that it's difficult for them, acknowledge that, have those conversations and ask them, what can we do to help? And make sure that they understand why you're doing what you're doing with the child. And in the same way as I was talking about then, the parent is then at the edge of their comfort zone, or they might actually have got to the point where they're terrified. But if the child goes off and they come back and everybody is okay, then the parent has a learning opportunity as well. So the parent then realises, oh, actually, do you know what? I can manage and they can manage, and next time it hopefully won't be so bad.
That's just really interesting, because one thing I've noticed is the sea provides this physical boundary of separation between the parent and the child, so you have to kind of separate them.
That's exactly what I was thinking. You get the child to the water and keep the parent on the sand, but it does require the people, right? If you've only got enough staff that, you've got staff with the kids and there isn't anybody left to talk to the parent, then that's a bit harder. But I imagine it can often be just separating the child and the parent, right? Because the parent is anxious and saying, oh, I'm not sure they should come, I'm going to just hold on to them, or they're really scared, they don't want to do it, I don't think they should do it. And well, why don't we just go down and feel how the water feels on our toes, or just something to get the child away, and then you can have that conversation with the parent about, we really need you on side, what can we do, let's do what we can to make this happen.
Okay, I've got another question on the app. We see a decrease in playing in children, but also physical activity in adults, and even more important, active movement behaviour. What transfer can we make from your children results to adults, and specific to support active movement behaviour in brackets disabled adults? Thanks for your report and research. I think they're asking
It feels like there's multiple bits to that question.
Yeah, there's sort of
Yeah.
several bits to that.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about children because my work is about prevention of mental health problems, and I think that has to happen in children. But everything that I said applies to adults. It applies to everybody in this room. It applies to us as human beings. We've evolved to be people that move and that are outdoors and that have some kind of connection to the natural world around us. And if you take away those things, then you end up with bad mental health. So definitely those things are linked. Definitely as adults, we want to be challenging ourselves sometimes. We want to have adventures. We want to go into nature. We want to be physically active. But what we know is that if children are not physically active and they're not connected to nature, they'll become adults that are not physically active and not connected to nature. So again, you have to get that right in childhood. Those habits in childhood, they know how good all that stuff feels, then they'll carry on doing it. But if their childhood is spent indoors, sitting down, not outdoors and not in nature, and they're anxious because they never have adventures, then why would they become adults that suddenly have adventures, right? So again, it is just, I think, we have to get childhood right if we want healthy adults. But we should also be conscious of what we're modelling as well. Like, it's not okay for us to not be active and not be doing those things, but expect our children to be outdoors all the time. Like, I'm going to sit here and watch TV, but you should go play outside. It's very important for you to be in the garden. Or I'm going to sit here on my phone, but it's so annoying. The kids are on their screens all the time. How many hours a day do we spend looking at a screen? And then we criticise children all the time for being on their screens. They don't know how to have fun and be children. And then there we are on our screens. So it is about modelling as well. So even if, you're not a particularly active adult and you haven't done any of these things, is there a way that you could be doing them so that your children and other children see you doing them? So I think that we have to have some responsibility. We can't just be like, well, the kids should definitely be outside more. Those kids, whilst we're not. So. And then there's a question about disabled adults, right? Physical activity and disabled adults. Yeah, which isn't my area of expertise, but all of these things apply to everybody. So it doesn't, if you're in a wheelchair or you've got a prosthetic limb or, you have a learning disability, it doesn't change your need to have these experiences, but we may need to think more creatively about how we ensure that people have access to them. So I had a lovely walk last night along the coastal path. If I was in a wheelchair, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So where can those people go and how can they access those spaces is important.
By the way, I should just explain that when you hear people clicking their fingers,
Yeah.
that's a sign of appreciation at our conferences.
I was earlier like, what's going on? So I'm just going to carry on talking. We'll pretend that didn't happen.
It's a reference to the African roots of ISTO, which started in
okay, great.
just thought I'd explain that. Loads of questions here for you, Helen. I think loads of people want to pick your brains. Where are we? How can surf therapy programs support and contribute to research for outdoor adventure therapy? Any suggested starting points?
How can surf therapy programs contribute to... I think they already are. Hannah and I are having some good chats, trying to get her to come and do some more research with us. I think surf therapy is part of a bigger picture, right? It's a piece within a puzzle. My work is mostly about play in children and children's need for that free, unstructured play. There's work about adventure playgrounds and the role that they have and, what children get from those kind of play experiences. There's adventure play, there's things like rock climbing. Anecdotally, people talk about the amazing benefits of rock climbing, but the mechanisms are all the same. They're tapping into the same thing, which is what we realised when we presented together previously, that we're talking about and we're seeing the same things, we're just seeing them in these different situations. So I think getting all of that stuff coming together and showing kind of consistency, if we can show that the WAVE project has similar outcomes to children going to an adventure playgrounds, clicking your fingers, and adventure play in schools and climbing, and they all have the same outcomes on kids, then how convincing is that? And that's great because it means that we don't have to say to kids, well, you have to go surfing. I know this is a bit off because I'm at a surfing therapy conference, but you don't have to go surfing. Actually, you could go climbing, or you could go to an adventure playground, or you could go, I don't know, mountain biking, or You could do any of these things, and then they have choice. Isn't that great? Don't we all want choice, right? Rather than there's this specific program in Cornwall that's really good for you, so you should go do that. So for me, it's about, a piece of that puzzle, and I think we're already contributing to that, definitely.
Okay, thank you. There's another one. Regarding the aspect of encouraging children to be adventurous and face uncertainty, how do we deal with the fact that some children just won't be ready emotionally or physically to undertake a certain activity? Can it be sometimes considered brave for a child to choose not to do an activity and express that emotion if they feel /no, it's not right for them yet?
That's a really interesting question. Yes, I think that it is brave sometimes to say no. It's brave to speak out and say that's too much for me, that's not for me. And I think that that's a fantastic lesson for children, that when you're in a situation that you're not comfortable with, then you say, no, I'm not doing that. And none of us should be forcing children to do something they don't want to do. So I think if I was in that situation where a child has said, I don't want to do that thing, I would say, you know what, I really respect that you've told me that. I know that's maybe wasn't an easy thing to do. So let's think about something that you can do. You know, what do you think would be something, that you could try today that was a bit of a challenge, something that would be a bit of a brave thing to do? So fair enough, you don't want to go abseil off that cliff, that's fine. But what could we do instead? Could we go and see if we can get lost walking in the woods, or could we maybe just climb up those rocks, or could we see if we can jump from one rock to another? So I would try and kind of acknowledge that they don't want to do the thing and respect that, but then not try and make sure they're not missing out on all the learning opportunities that they would have got from doing that thing. So what's the other stuff that we can do? And I'm sure you do it, as we were talking about just now with the surf therapy, that some children really don't want to get on a surfboard, right? And it might just be about paddling in the water, just feeling the sea or being in the waves. And that's okay. If that's the thing that's brave for them and adventurous for them, then that's fine. It's not about forcing them to do anything.
Thank you. This is a question you touched on this earlier, Helen, but how do we keep surf and outdoor therapy sessions safely boundaried for our clients?
So similar, I guess, as I was saying before, is about, thinking about where you want the edges to be, right? And if you're taking out people who are pretty proficient surfers, your boundaries are going to be much wider than if you're taking children who've never been in the ocean before, where you're thinking, right, I'm going to keep these kids all within about a metre of me, and I'm going to, or if they aren't particularly good swimmers, then, so you need to be responding to the children that you've got with you and the situation that you're in, but with as few rules as possible, right? So how many rules and how many restrictions do I need in place to be able to be confident that these kids are going to come out of this fine, but that they are getting enough challenge? So there always has to be some boundaries. I couldn't say now, well, the rules are this, these are the boundaries, because the boundaries depend on the weather, they depend on the children, they depend on the instructors, how experienced you are, how well you know the surf that you're in. All of those factors are important, but there does need to be some boundaries somewhere in order to keep them safe.
Cool, thank you. There's a lot of questions, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can while we've got you. Surf therapy programs prioritise underserved communities. By our very nature, we are inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
But many of us ask the question, who is nature for? Because of safety and access issues, why aren't children spending time in nature? Is it access to nature or addiction to cell phones, TV or gaming? So I guess this is a question about...
why are children in nature? It's complicated. So we've just finished some work actually with parents looking at what they see as the things that help them get kids out into nature and being adventurous, and the things that make that difficult. And the answer is it's complicated. It's multiple things, right? So there is, the obvious one, I think, that gets all the blame is the screens, right? The kids enjoy the screens, they're fun. Why wouldn't they? We all like our screens. That is a small part of a very big picture. It's also about who else is out there, right? Are there friends there? Are there people? Is it fun? Because if you're just going with mum, that's kind of boring, right? Once you're not 3 anymore, like, I don't want to play with me. How do you get there? Okay, is that going to require a car and petrol? Can I just walk out the door and it's there? Do I have to go on the bus for 3 hours to get there? When I get there, do I feel a sense of belonging? Is that a space that's there for me? Okay, there's quite a bit of work with minority groups who don't feel that space is there for them. You know, you go to a National Trust site, how many people do you see who aren't white, right? People don't necessarily feel that those spaces are there for them. A while ago, I visited a school in Westminster that has a tiny playground, smaller than this room. Lots of children from ethnic minorities. And the head teacher said to me, there are children in this school who on a Friday go home to their flat, and on a Monday they come back and they haven't left the flat the whole weekend. And these children live within spitting distance of like Hyde Park, St James's Park, like some of the most amazing parks in the country, but they don't see those parks as for them. They're not there for them. They're there for people that look like me. And that's really, you know, in this country, we have to address that. And we have to also be thinking about people with disabilities, people with special needs. How do we make sure that they feel that those spaces are for them and that they're welcome? There are disabled toilets, etc. You know, it's not difficult stuff, but it's stuff that often isn't thought about. And then there's traffic. I think a big factor is the community thing. Like, are other kids going there? Is it a place that's okay for kids? How many no ball game signs are there on the wall telling children, you know, pretty straight up, you're not welcome here. This green space is for me to look out of my window, not for you to be on. You know, don't be there making a nuisance of yourself. When they get older, like how many 13, 14, 15-year-olds feel like it's okay to go hang out in the woods and no one's going to tell them off for doing naughty stuff, you know? So it's multiple things. It isn't any one thing. And I think if we, you know, removed all screens from our lives, it's not that suddenly children would all be out in nature all of a sudden, right? Because all those other barriers are still there.
That's really interesting. Thank you. This question says, thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to ask if you're aware of any study or work being done about adventurous physical activity outdoors effect in elderly people's health and well-being. Appreciate it.
That's a really good question. Yeah, honestly, I don't know the answer to that because I'm really focused on the other end of the spectrum. It's a really interesting question. I would imagine that it would be really beneficial, but I don't know the answer in terms of whether there's research available on that or not.
Okay, and is there any difference between guided and free play?
Yes, one of them's guided. Yeah, there is. I mean, guided play tends to be that an adult has made a decision that, you know, I want this child to learn this particular thing, so I'm going to set up a play situation so that they learn that thing. Free play is, there you go, do what you like. You know, and I guess free play the children are still somewhat restricted with whatever they have in front of them, but the stuff that's there isn't there because you want them to learn a specific thing. You know, and sort of play-based learning and guided play, and they all have their place. And I would much rather that children were in a classroom using play-based learning than sat down copying stuff off I was going to say blackboard then, that's going to make me feel old, off a projector screen, whiteboard, I don't even know what they use, whiteboards. Play-based learning is fantastic. It's not free play, okay? And children, it isn't a replacement for free play. Children still need that opportunity to create their own environments and to have control and just be able to do whatever they want to do, right, without adults telling them. And they might feel, somebody who's very good at guided play might help the child to feel like they are deciding what they do. But often it doesn't feel like that. It's like, okay, build a tower, there's some blocks, off you go, you know. So, which feels very different to, I'm going to find some blocks and I'm going to build a tower because that's what I want to do.
Sure. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes or so left with you, Helen. I just want to check if there's any more questions from the room. Yeah, George?
I'm just quite interested because adults facilitate, there's an element where adults facilitate play for children. Are the stats for adults engaging in nature tracking in the same way they are for children? Because it's, you know,
in
that
terms of the
facilitate-
links to their mental health.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
in terms of are adults going into nature less?
Oh, good question. I think so. I don't know, again, because I focus on what kids are doing. Yeah, I'd imagine that they are. I mean, the evidence in terms of the link between being in nature and mental health is more robust in adults because there's more research, because people care about adults more because they are adults, the people doing the work. So, yeah, there's no doubt that being in nature is good for mental health in adults, but I think probably adults are spending less time in nature, but I don't know the answer to that, actually. It would vary hugely by demographic group, I would imagine, you know, based on what I was saying before, but yeah, I don't know, sorry.
Thank you.
Definitely get to the point where we should stop asking questions, because I'm increasingly saying I don't know, I don't know the answer. I'll Google it in a break and I'll tell you.
Sure. So, there's a question here: re-anxious parents and parents needing to do more than expect children to engage in outdoor play. Do you and the WAVE project see a bigger benefit? I think that's asking.
With anxious parents, is there a bigger benefit?
Is there a bigger benefit for anxious parents?
Yeah.
To get their children to engage in outdoor play.
Yeah, potentially, I guess. Because, you know, if the parent is anxious about the child doing that and the child does it, then the parent's anxiety, it will be affected as well, right? So the parent will learn, actually, I can be in a situation where I feel anxious about what my child's doing and it went okay and it wasn't too bad, and they get that exposure to uncertainty and things. I mean, it's unlikely in an anxious parent to be enough to shift it hugely, because they probably have been anxious for quite a long time. But I think, you know, it's a bit hard to work exactly what the question is, but if the question is it more beneficial for children of anxious parents than it is for children of non-anxious parents, then potentially yes, because those parents are less likely to have found those opportunities for their children to be adventurous by themselves, because their anxiety would mean that they try and keep the child safe. So should we be really thinking about, you know, getting kids to the WAVE project or doing adventurous play whose parents are anxious, then yes, we should, if that's the question. So, it's multiple answers to a single question. Hopefully that covers it.
I certainly think that those of us who work in surf therapy have seen this happen. You know, once a child sort of gets a bit of space from an anxious parent, they almost immediately kind of start to feel calm.
Yeah.
Did you want to ask a question, Helen?
Hi, thanks, Helen. It was really just to contribute to that answer, I think, really,
Yeah.
and to say that some of the interviews that we've done with parents and to look at the relationship between the impact on the child and the parents is to say that there's a lot of modelling goes on with the WAVE project. So for some of the parents, you know, just watching the way in which adults can work with children or play with the children in the sea is in itself a very positive benefit on a learning experience for them.
Yeah, that really makes sense. So they see this other person interacting with their child
And letting their child go.
Maybe, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. This is going to be the last question. You're probably pleased to know. So, do you also put interventions for social anxiety into the programmes?
Yeah, where does social anxiety fit? Social anxiety is an interesting one. It's hard to see sometimes how the physical risk stuff can affect social anxiety until you think about embarrassment and failure in front of other kids, right? So when you take a group of kids out surfing, or when there's a group of kids at an adventure playground, when a group of kids go climbing, there's other children there. It's a social situation, right? Do you want to be the one that wipes out in front of the other kids? Do you want to be the one that's crying because you're too scared to go in the water? So I think often these physical risk situations put us actually in a social risk situation as well. And a lot of what's going on for kids in that situation is I don't want to look stupid in front of these other people. So they are getting some of that exposure to the social anxiety side of things as well. So I think it probably does benefit social anxiety. I think social anxiety is slightly more complex than that children do also need to be exposed to other social situations. That one situation is unlikely to be enough. The skills and things like the coping with the uncertainty, knowing that you can cope, etc., still apply, because if you're, one of the issues with social anxiety is, well, what if it all goes wrong? Like, what if I stand up here and I forget what I'm going to say, or I can't answer a question and I look stupid? That is a kind of social anxiety thoughts, and you still have to be okay with uncertainty. You still have to think, I can cope with whatever happens. So the skills are still important, but really, helping a child with social anxiety requires being in multiple social situations. So the social situation of the adventure is one of those social situations, but it may not be enough without them also being okay in other social situations. Because we've all done this, right, where we go, well, that was okay, but that was different. That's not like standing up and giving a presentation. That's not like meeting people I don't know. That's not like going to school. So I think it would help, but it may not be enough, is my answer based on no data, just in theory, my answer.
Well, thank you, Helen. Can we give Helen a round of applause? It's been really amazing to have you with us, and come back again when you've completed your study. Yeah, exactly. So we have a break now, apparently, if anyone wants to grab a drink or have a comfort break, and we'll be back shortly. Just a couple of minutes, though, guys, please, and we've got another speaker shortly.